All right, welcome back. I hope everybody had a nice lunch. And we're ready for the final stretch today. 2 presentations, both of them on the 6th seal. And of course now we're going to do part 1. And then the second session will deal primarily with the second part of the 6th seal. Before we do, we want to have a word of prayer like we always do. So let's bow our heads for a word of prayer. Our Father and our God, thank you for this wonderful day that you have given us. There's so many things to be thankful for. We wouldn't have enough pen and paper to write down all of them because you're so good. We ask, Lord, that you will be with us now as we open your word again. Give us clarity of thought. Give us tender hearts. And Lord, empower us to present to others the marvelous things from your word. Thank you for the promise of your presence, and we claim that promise in the name which is above all names, the name of Jesus. Amen. Amen. Okay, let's review what we've studied so far. The first seal represents what stage of history? Okay, the apostolic church going out conquering and to conquer. Thousands come into the church through the preaching of the apostles. Who does that disturb? Disturbed Satan. He said, I don't like this. I'm losing all my subjects from paganism to Christianity. So then you have the second horse, the red horse, the horse that sheds blood, the horse of persecution. So persecution arises. That's the period of the Roman emperors when paganism persecuted God's people. So then Satan says, you know, this isn't working because the more that I persecute them, the more they are. So I'm going to have to change my strategy. So he says, instead of fighting them, let's join them. And so he introduces apostasy into the church. He infiltrates the church with pagan customs and practices, with the world. And of course, that leads to spiritual famine, and it ultimately leads to the death of God's people under the 4th seal. Primarily, the yellow horse, the horse of death, the horse of the grave. And that represents the period when the papacy mowed down God's faithful people. And then, of course, we have the 5th seal, which is connected with the 4th. Under the 5th seal, those that were slain during the period of the 4th horse, the yellow horse, the period of the papal dominion, now they start crying out, until when, O Lord, do you not judge and avenge our blood from those who shed the blood on the earth? And we notice that the 5th seal has 2 stages. The first stage of the martyrs who cry out is the martyrs who died during the 1260 years that are now crying out to God for justice. And then we notice that there's a second stage to the 5th seal. That is, the future martyrs will cry out for God to judge and avenge those who shed their blood. So the 5th seal has 2 distinct stages, one past, one future. We're going to notice now that the 6th seal also has 2 distinct stages. But before we notice that, let's read the passage that describes the 6th seal. This is the longest passage of all the seals, many, many verses. I begin in Revelation 6 and verse 12. I looked when he opened the 6th seal, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became like blood, not darkened, but became like blood. And the stars of heaven fell to the earth, as a fig tree drops its late figs, which basically is unripe figs, when it is shaken by a mighty wind. Then, this is a very important word, then the sky receded as a scroll when it is rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved out of its place. And the kings of the earth, those would be the rulers who govern the nations of the world, the great men, the high officers of the state, the rich men, that is the socially wealthy, the commanders of armies, the mighty men, these are the great men in battle, every slave and every free man, regular everyday citizens, hid themselves. Why did they hide themselves? Because they found themselves naked. You know, you'll notice under the sixth seal it says that if you're not covered with the righteousness of Christ, you will be found naked, spiritually, of course. And so it says here, once again, the mighty men, every slave and every free man, hid themselves in the caves and the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us, and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath has come, and who is able to stand? So this is a description of the sixth seal. Now, there are several things that we need to ask, the first of which is, are these signs in the heavens, the great earthquake, are they to be understood literally or symbolically? We know that most of the book of Revelation contains symbolic language that must be decoded. However, Seventh-day Adventists believe that the great earthquake and the signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars were literal events. The question is why? We find the reason in the meaning of the Greek word that appears 4 times in the sixth seal, Revelation 6, 12, and 13. And it is the word as, hos in Greek. Ranko Stefanovic explained the meaning of this word. The repeated usage of the word as or like in the text appears to be very significant. The sun becomes black as sackcloth. So you already have a symbolism here, right? The sun becomes black as sackcloth. The moon as blood. The stars of the sky fall as do the figs of the fig tree. And heaven splits as the papyrus scroll. So in other words, a reality is being compared with a symbol. Are you following me or not? What are the symbols? The symbols are, first of all, sackcloth. Secondly, blood. Third, the figs that fall from a tree. And 4, a papyrus scroll. So the comparison is already there. Are you with me or not? In Greek, this word introduces a figurative analogy to an actual event. That is, compared with something figurative. This suggests that these heavenly signs are intended to be taken what? Literally. And something is used as an analogy to illustrate the literal event. Now let's notice the link between the fifth and the sixth seals. The plea of the martyrs of the Dark Ages, the question, how long until you judge and avenge, in Revelation 6 verse 10, finds its answer in Daniel 7, 8 through 10, and Daniel 8, 13 and 14, where the process of judgment begins to exonerate them from the faulty verdicts of earthly courts. According to these passages in Daniel, the trampling of the sanctuary and of God's people would last until the conclusion of the 2300 days, where the process of vindicating the sanctuary and its worshipers would begin. The signs in Revelation 6, 12, and 13 are an earthly announcement that the vindicating judgment is about to begin. In other words, these are signs that the final judgment is about to begin. Incidentally, every time that Jesus begins a new work, there is an earthly announcement, a powerful earthly announcement. When Jesus came to this earth and became incarnate and was born, was there a powerful announcement? Yes, the angels in heaven sang. The wise men came from the east. The Bible says that the whole of Jerusalem was in a tumult. So there was an announcement that the Messiah had been born. Let me ask you, when Jesus began his ministry, was there someone that brought the attention to the idea that the Messiah was about to come? Someone who prepared the way? Yes, who was it? John the Baptist. When Jesus was about to die on the cross, was there an event in Jerusalem that attracted all eyes to Jesus? Yes, the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. When the day of Pentecost had come, was there a powerful earthly announcement that Jesus had been installed as high priest in the heavenly sanctuary? Yes, there was a mighty rushing wind, and there were tongues of fire, and they started talking in languages. By the way, I didn't mention the resurrection of Christ. Was there a powerful message that Christ had resurrected? Yes, those who resurrected with him and went into the city. Let me ask you, would you expect then to be a powerful announcement indicating that the judgment was about to begin? Of course. These signs actually have the main purpose of indicating to the inhabitants of the earth, start studying prophecy. Because when they see these things, immediately they're going to start thinking about what? Revelation chapter 6, 12, and 13. And so what God is saying is study prophecy because a very important event is about to transpire. And then, of course, the Millerites also made a powerful announcement about the coming of the day of judgment. Do you suppose that there's going to be also some kind of earthly indication that the judgment of the living is beginning? What would that be? There's a powerful angel that descends from heaven and fills the whole earth with his glory and proclaims the fall of Babylon, which divides the worlds into two groups, prepares the righteous for this final sealing, and the wicked receive the mark of the beast. The final loud cry, the earth filled with the glory of the Lord, is actually the proclamation that the judgment that began in 1844 with the dead is now passing to a new stage, the stage of the living. And we don't have a date for that. There are individuals today that are putting dates. They say, you know, judgment, the investigative judgment of Adventists began in September of 2015. Well, you know, when the Pope visited the United States, they're more precise, September 23, 2015. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that we can establish a date for the beginning of the judgment of the living. They're also saying that the Sunday law, the national Sunday law, is going to be proclaimed in March or April of this year. Nowhere in the Bible do you find any indication, unless you twist the scriptures, that the Sunday law is going to come in March or April of 2019. When time passes, what happens? People are worse off than before because they say, oh, you know, what's the use? You have these predictions and they never take place. That's why Ellen White said 1844 is the last date. No more dates for prophetic events. Now, let's notice then here, returning to the syllabus, it is noteworthy that the sixth church, the sixth seal, and the sixth trumpet all take us to the same moment in the course of church history. You say, how is that? Under the sixth church, God places before the church an open door. Where does that open door lead to? The most holy place for the final judgment. Under the sixth seal, you have the sealing of the 144,000. That also has to do with judgment. And the sixth trumpet, you have, at the end of the sixth trumpet, you have the opening of the temple in heaven, and the ark of his covenant is seen. So when you get to number 6, whether it be the churches, the seals, or the trumpets, you're at the same moment of time, the beginning of the investigative judgment in 1844. Now we're on page 235. The sixth seal mentions 2 earthquakes. Did you notice that the sixth seal has 2 earthquakes? One transpires at the beginning of the sixth seal, and the other at its end. Now the fact that there's 2 earthquakes would seem to indicate that there's 2 stages, right? Verse 12 describes the one at the beginning. And verse 14 describes the one at the end. Revelation 16, verse 18 and 20, which is the seventh plague, further amplifies the second earthquake as a cataclysmic and global event. That is to say, the earthquake in Revelation 6:14 is the same one as Revelation 16, 18, and 20, which is the seventh plague, which is right at the moment when Jesus comes. The earthquake in Revelation 6:12 is preliminary and local. The one in Revelation 16:18 will be global and the greatest in human history. Only the greatest earthquake in history could remove mountains and islands from their places on a global scale. Are you catching this picture? Now we're going to put some flesh on the bones here. We're going to prove it. But I want you to have this clear in your mind. Now, what are the purposes for these signs? There are several. I wrote down here 5. First, they announced that the Great Tribulation during the 1260 years is what? Is about to come to an end. Second, they serve as an omen of the fall of the papal power. Third, they serve to draw attention to the approaching judgment in 1844. Fourth, they serve as indicators of the beginning of the time of the end. And finally, they do announce the soon coming of Jesus. Now, what do we mean by the soon coming of Jesus? You know, somebody recently came out with a video saying that at the General Conference session, we had actually changed our fundamental belief on the second coming, that we no longer believe in the second coming of Christ. Because in the fundamental belief, it was changed that Jesus' coming is imminent, and it was changed to soon. So I decided that I would check and see what is the meaning of imminent. Do you know that Ellen White uses the word imminent about 22 times, I think it is, in her writings on a CD-ROM. Every single time it appears in a negative context. The imminence of a calamity. Is the second coming a calamity for God's people? No, not those who are waiting for the imminent, soon coming of Christ. It's a joy. So the change to the word soon is really good. And by the way, soon and imminent are very similar. Now, let's go back here. Critics, both within and without the Seventh-day Adventist Church, argue thus. How is it possible to believe that events that took place over 250 years ago are signs of the soon coming of Jesus? Isn't this stretching credulity to its limit? On the surface, this argument might appear persuasive until we look at the number of these years in the context of a broader perspective. Let us suppose, for the sake of argument, that I am going to take a 6,000-mile trip. When I start the trip, we all agree that my destination is very distant. When I'm halfway there, the destination is still a long ways off. However, would you agree that when I am 250 miles from my destination, my arrival is near? After all, 250 years of 6,000 is only 4%. Are you following me? Now, Mervyn Maxwell, who was my teacher at the seminary, he passed away many years ago, wrote a book called Magnificent Disappointment. And on pages 91 and 92, this was published in 1994, he wrote the following words. We need a change of perspective. Instead of looking back to 1844 and finding it around 150 years in the past, let us go back to the beginning of human history and view 1844 as almost 6,000 years in the future. From the perspective of Eden, at the beginning of Earth's 6,000 years, the remaining distance between 1844 and the 1990s, this book was written in the 1990s, is hardly discernible. These 150 years between 1844 and the 1990s represent only 1/40th, 2.5% of human history. More than 90%, 97% of human history took place prior to 1844. Yes, we are indeed at the end of time. The final judgment began only yesterday, as it were. Christ's advent is coming soon. So see, it all depends what perspective you use. You know, if you use a perspective, from our perspective, 250 years, that's a long time. But if you looked at the whole sweep of Christian history, it's a different story. Now, the enemies of traditional Adventism, including some Adventists, and those who are inimical to Ellen White, also have frequently pointed out that there have been other earthquakes, dark days, and star showers in history. They argue, what makes the Lisbon earthquake of 1755, the dark day of 1780, and the moon looking like blood also in 1780, May 19, and the Leonid star shower of 1833 so unique? There have been these phenomena on occasions after that and before that. The answer is found in 4 points: location, order, time, and intensity. Let's begin with location. It is not coincidental that these signs did not occur in Africa, in Asia, or any of these places. Where did they occur? They occurred in Europe, and where else? In the United States of America. Why? Europe was significant because there the papacy would receive what? The deadly wound that would mark the end of the 1260-year tribulation and would begin the time of the end. The United States was significant, especially New England, because there the message of the judgment would be proclaimed powerfully by the Millerites beginning in the 1830s. Once again, I read from C. Mervyn Maxwell. The location of the classic signs was highly significant. They happened in Europe and America primarily, where people were studying the Bible and pondering the prophecies. A dark day in the Sahara Desert or a star shower over New Guinea would have said little in those days about the second coming of Christ to cannibal headhunters or Muslim nomads. Events need not be universal to deliver a global message. A few square miles at Hiroshima and Nagasaki were sufficient to announce the atomic age. A stable in Bethlehem ushered in the Christian era. Only a few hundred people saw Jesus after his resurrection, but they told others. Are you catching the point? Very good point. Secondly, these signs are special because of their order. Not only the location where they occurred, but the order in which they occurred. These phenomena occurred in history precisely in the chronological order described in Revelation 6. The Lisbon earthquake occurred in 1755. The dark day and the moon like blood in 1780. And the star shower took place in 1833. Show me one other instance in human history where these phenomena have taken place in this precise order within a period of less than 100 years. The order of these signs led people to study the prophecies. Because they say, yes, Lisbon, the greatest earthquake ever seen in the history of the world to that point. And then they say, the sun darkened, the moon looking like blood, and then this shower of stars. They say, what does this bring to mind? Oh, there's a passage in the Bible, Revelation 6, 12, and 13, in that exact order. And so it leads them to search the prophecies, the order in which the signs took place. Third point, these signs occurred precisely at the right time. Immediately before the 1260-year tribulation came to an end, and just before the fulfillment of the prophecies concerning the fall of the papacy and the beginning of the judgment in 1844. Their timing was perfect. And then finally, their intensity. Concerning the intensity of these signs, C. Mervyn Maxwell has well stated, and by the way, there are several pages of the sixth seal that we are not even going to look at, because there's 20 pages and we need another session, and they're in your syllabus and you can read them, about what people from that day and age say about the signs. You need to read those statements. There's 20 pages, 249 to 269 in your syllabus. Let's read then what Mervyn Maxwell had to say. As recently as 1980, the widely respected seismologist G.A. Ivey, in Chapter 11 of his book Earthquakes, ranked the Lisbon earthquake as the largest shock ever, and reckoned that it may well have reached an almost incredible 9.0 on the Richter scale, 7 times stronger than the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. The dark day of May 19, 1780 has not been equal in North America in the 200 years that have since come and gone. The Leonid shower, because it came from the constellation of Leo, by the way, the Leonid shower of November 13, 1833, gave birth to a new branch of astronomy. Like the Lisbon earthquake and the famous dark day, it too has not been matched in spite of the scientific expectations that it would be. So do we have a good reason as Adventists to believe that these signs were fulfilled on the dates in which Adventists have said they were fulfilled? You know, we're not just guessing, there are reasons. And once again, there are 4 reasons. The first reason is location, where they took place. The second is order, in the exact order that we find in Revelation 6. The time, right when the 1260 years were coming to an end, the papacy was about to receive its deadly wound, the judgment was about to begin, and finally, the intensity of these particular signs. You can do additional research if you Google these dates and the events that took place on these dates. Now let's see what Ellen White had to say about the 6th seal. Ellen White, this is very interesting. Ellen White explains the first part of the 6th seal in Great Controversy, page 304. She deals with the Lisbon earthquake and with the dark day and the moon looking like blood on page 304 and 333. On page 304, she quotes Revelation 6:12. And on page 333, she quotes Revelation 6:13. So there you find her commentary on Revelation 6:12 and 13. But now something very interesting happens. However, she does not quote on those pages verses 14 to 17, which is the second part of the 6th seal, until pages 641 and 642. Over 300 pages between where she quotes Revelation 6:12 and 13 and where she quotes Revelation chapter 6, 14 through 17. What is the reason for the 300-page gap between her comments on verses 12 and 13 and her remarks on verses 14 through 17? In order to comprehend this long parenthesis between the first and last part of the 6th seal, we must remember some things we studied under the 5th seal. How many stages to the 5th seal? 2. How many to the 6th seal? 2. Let's notice this. The papacy has how many stages of power? 1 past and 1 future. The 1 past was when? During the 1260 years. The future one is when its wound is healed at the end of time. Therefore, the tribulation also has what? We studied this, 2 stages. 1 past, when the papacy persecuted, that was the greatest tribulation in terms of length, and the greatest tribulation in history with regards to intensity takes place in the future. Regarding the first period of persecution, Ellen White wrote, this is the top of page 239, for more than 1,000 years, such persecution as the world had never before known was to come upon Christ's followers. Millions upon millions of his faithful witnesses were to be slain. So you'll notice that the papacy has two stages. The tribulation has two stages. Therefore, the signs in the heavens have two stages too. You say, what do you mean? Well, let's pursue this. The first group of cosmic signs announces the end of the first period of tribulation and the soon-to-begin judging portion of the fifth seal. Are you understanding that point? The second set of cosmic signs announces the end of the second tribulation period and the avenging portion of the fifth seal. In between these 2 points of time, we have the vindicating judgment of the martyrs and the sealing of the 144,000 living saints. Are you with me? 2 of you are. You're spellbound. Isn't this amazing? Now, let's continue. The first stage of the signs took place in 1755, 1780, 1833, which is earthquake, sun darkened, moon looking like blood, stars falling from heaven. These signs announced that the first stage of persecution by the papacy was about to end and the vindicating judgment was about to begin. These signs are referred to in Revelation 6, 12, and 13, and Joel 2, verse 31. The second stage of the signs will take place immediately before the second coming of Jesus and will mark the deliverance of the saints from the second stage of persecution by the papacy, and Revelation 6, 14 through 17 describes these signs. Now let's talk about the 2 sets of signs. Is there going to be an earthquake when Jesus comes? A global earthquake? Yes. Is the sun going to be darkened? Is the moon going to look like blood? No. Are the stars going to fall from heaven? No. You see, the signs of Revelation 6, 12, and 13 are different than the signs in verses 14 to 17. The signs in Revelation 6, 12, and 13 are the signs that announce what is going to happen in 1844. The signs that take place in verses 14 through 17 announce the coming of Jesus Christ. And we're going to pursue this. Will the signs of Revelation 6, 12, and 13 have another fulfillment in the future? No. In Joel 2:31 and in Revelation 6, 12, and 13, we have 2 important details that distinguish these signs from the ones in the future. We need to read the scriptures carefully. When there are certain things that are said differently in 2 verses, when something is missing in a verse that is not in the other verse, it's important. Now let's continue. First, according to Joel 2:31, the signs of Revelation 6, 12, and 13 occur before the great and terrible day of the Lord. We're going to read these verses in a moment. Second, in the signs of Revelation 6, 12, and 13, the moon looks as blood and the stars fall from heaven. However, in the signs of Revelation 6, 14 to 17, which will occur at the second coming, the moon and the stars do not give their light. Is there a difference there? Believe me, when the stars fell in 1833, they gave lots of light. So we begin to see that we're dealing with different sets of signs. One set of signs that leads to the beginning of the investigative judgment, the other set of signs that announces the avenging portion. In other words, Jesus is coming to deliver his people from certain death. Joel 2, verse 10 and 11, Joel 3, 15 and 16, and Matthew 24, verse 30, refer to a second great earthquake and a set of signs in the heavenly bodies that will be fulfilled when Jesus comes. These signs will occur as Jesus is preparing to leave heaven for earth. The darkening of the sun and moon will announce the coming of Jesus. There will be a cosmic global earthquake as well. In heaven and on earth, that will announce his departure from heaven. The two sets of signs are different. Let's notice Revelation 6, 12, and 13. These verses describe the moon becoming like blood, not darkening. The text also tells us that the stars fell from heaven. These preliminary signs are not the same ones as those in Matthew 24, when the voice of God will move the sun, moon, and stars out of their places. As a result, the planet will be in darkness during the millennium. Notice these verses that we read before. I looked when he opened the sixth seal, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became like blood, and the stars of heaven fell to the earth as a fig tree drops its late figs when it is shaken by a mighty wind. Now, Joel 2:31 is referring to the same signs that we find in Revelation 6, 12, and 13. Notice that Joel 2, verse 31, says something very interesting. At the bottom of page 240, the sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood. Is that the same signs of Revelation 6? Yes. But then what does it say? What word appears after that? Before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. Are there some signs in the sun, moon, and stars before Jesus comes? Absolutely. Those are the ones in Revelation 6, 12, and 13. Now, on the other hand, these other passages that are mentioned are referring to the signs in the sun, moon, and stars and an earthquake when Jesus comes. Let's notice those verses. Joel 2, 10 and 11 depicts different signs than those in Revelation 6, 12, and 13, and Joel 2, 31. In the Joel passage, the earth and the heavens tremble. Not only the earth and the heavens tremble. The moon grows dark and the stars do not shine. And if you read the context, verses 1 through 11 are describing the second coming of Jesus, as does Revelation 6, 14 through 16. Notice that Joel 2:11, which is the culmination of the second coming, ends with the same question as the sixth seal. Let's read Joel 2, 10 and 11. The earth quakes before them. When it says them, it's talking about God's armies. This is Jesus coming on the white horse. The armies of heaven are following him. This is the second coming. You have to read verses 1 through 10. The earth quakes before them. The heavens tremble. The sun and moon grow dark, and the stars what? Diminish their brightness. Not they fall, they diminish their brightness. The Lord gives voice before his army, for his camp is very great. For strong is the one who executes his word. For the day of the Lord is great and very terrible, and who can endure it? Is that the same question at the end of the sixth seal? Absolutely. Are they the same signs as Revelation 6, 12, and 13? No. Notice Joel 3, 15, and 16. These verses do not describe the same signs spoken of in Revelation 6, 12, and 13. The text tells us that the heavens and the earth will shake, and the sun and the moon will be dark, and the stars will not shine. Believe me, the stars in 1833 shone real bright. They terrified people as they saw. You know, it looked like there was rain falling from heaven, and it was bright. The night was bright. Let's read Joel 3, 15 and 16. The sun and the moon will grow dark. Not that the moon will be turned into blood. The sun and moon will grow dark. And the stars will diminish their brightness. The Lord also will roar from Zion and utter his voice from Jerusalem. Not only the earth, but the heavens and the earth will shake. But the Lord will be a shelter for his people and the strength of the children of Israel. And then we have another passage in Isaiah, chapter 13, verses 10 to 13. This passage is not parallel to Revelation 6, 12, and 13. In these verses, the sun, the moon, and the stars grow dark. This did not happen in 1755, 1780, and 1833. When Jesus comes, the voice of God will move the heavens and the earth out of their places. And I'm going to read those verses. Behold, the day of the Lord comes. What is the day of the Lord when the Bible speaks of the day of the Lord? It's speaking about the day of vengeance, the day of second coming. Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel, with both what? Wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate. And he will destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine. In other words, the heavens will be in what? In total darkness. Different than Revelation 6, 12, and 13. I will punish the world for its evil, and the wicked for their iniquity. I will halt the arrogance of the proud, and will lay low the haughtiness of the terrible. I will make a mortal, probably should be mortal man, but anyway, I will make a mortal more rare than fine gold, a man more than the golden wedge of Ophir. Therefore I will shake the heavens, and the earth will move out of her place in the wrath of the Lord of hosts, and in the day of his fierce anger. Does that sound like what happened in 1755, 1780, and 1833? No, these are different signs. The signs of Revelation 6, 12, and 13 are not repeated, because Revelation 6 has 2 earthquakes. Now, Revelation 6 describes the signs in the very order in which they historically occurred, as I mentioned. The great earthquake, 1755, the darkening of the sun, 1780, the moon becoming like blood that very evening, 1780, May 19, the stars falling from heaven, 1833. So what is the inevitable conclusion? The inevitable conclusion is that the signs in Joel 2:31, Acts 2:20, which we didn't read, and Revelation 6, 12, and 13 are different than the ones in Matthew 24:30, Joel 2, 10 and 11, Joel 3, 15 and 16, and Isaiah 13, verse 10 through verse 13. There is a difference between the expression, the time of the end, and the end of time. The time of the end is a period. The end of time is when Jesus comes. While the signs of Revelation 6, 12, and 13 announce that the history of the planet was entering upon the time of the end, the signs in Matthew 24:30 announce the end of time. Notice the entire passage of Matthew 24, 29 to 31. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, by the way, have you noticed that there's 2 references to tribulation in Matthew 24? In verse 21, there's mention of a tribulation. That's the period of papal persecution. And then in verse 29, you have tribulation again, because you have 2 stages to the tribulation. So it says that immediately after the tribulation of those days, that is the 1260 years, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. Are these the same signs that led up to 1844? No. Because Matthew 24 says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, this is the final tribulation, the second stage of tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. What happens next? Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. Is this similar to Revelation 6, 14 to 17? Yes. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn as they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So let me ask you, the signs in the heavens and the earthquake that is mentioned in Matthew chapter 24, what do they announce? The beginning of the investigated judgment, or do they announce the second coming of Christ? It's the second coming of Christ. Now, who are the powers of the heavens that Matthew 24:29 mentions? Well, Genesis 1:16 tells us that the sun was made to rule the day, and the moon and the stars were made to rule the night. Ellen White, in Early Writings, page 41, explains very well what will happen with the heavenly bodies when Jesus comes. Notice this significant statement. I saw that when the Lord said heaven, in giving the signs recorded by whom? Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're all parallel passages. He meant heaven. And when he said earth, he meant earth. The powers of heaven are what? The sun, the moon, and the stars. They rule in the heavens. The powers of the earth are those that rule on the earth. The powers of heaven, what are the powers of heaven according to what you said? Sun, moon, and stars. The powers of heaven will be shaken at the voice of God. Then the sun, moon, and stars will be what? Moved out of their places. They will not pass away, but be shaken by the voice of God. And that's the reason why during the millennium, the earth will be what? Without form and void. And Jeremiah said, I beheld the heavens, and in them there was no light. Why? Because the sun, moon, and stars have been what? They have been darkened. Now, let's notice here Ellen G. White and the signs. As we've stated before, Ellen White quotes Revelation 6, 12, and 13 in the Great Controversy, page 304, and then the falling of the stars in 333, and applies them to the signs that took place in 1755, 1870, and 1833. She does not quote verses 14 through 17 until you get to pages 641 and 642. Now, let's read that passage where she quotes Revelation chapter 6, verse 14 and 15 to 17. She's actually quoting in the chapter that has to do with the second coming of Christ. It says, the King of Kings, what? Descends upon the cloud, wrapped in flaming fire. The heavens are rolled together as a scroll. The earth trembles before him. And every mountain and island is moved out of its place. Is she describing Revelation 6:14? Yes. And the kings of, now she's going to quote verses 15 to 17. And the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the rich men, and the chief captains, and the mighty men, and every bondman, and every free man hid themselves in dens and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us, and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of his wrath is come. And who shall be able to stand? So where does Ellen White see the fulfillment of verses 14 to 17? At the second coming. Where does she see the fulfillment of verses 12 and 13? The signs that announce the end of the papal dominion, the end of the tribulation of the 1260 years, the beginning of the time of the end, and the beginning of the investigative judgment. That's the real reason why you have these signs. It's not to indicate that Jesus is coming tomorrow. We already looked at the time issue. Let's continue. Why did Ellen White separate verses 12 and 13 from verses 14 through 17 by over 300 pages? Clearly, because she knew there would be a long time parenthesis between the events of verses 12 and 13 and verses 14 through 17. And once again, this is a reiteration so that we are absolutely clear on this point. The principle at work here is that the signs that mark the end of the two stages of the tribulation, the signs mark the signs in the heavens, and the earthquake mark the end of the two times of tribulation, the past and the future. In both cases, the signs indicate that God has intervened to what? To deliver his people and to bring the tribulation to an end. In the first instance, from the oppression of the 1260 years, and in the second instance, from the oppression of the time of Jacob's trouble. And by the way, what happens during the period after the signs in the heavens and the beginning of the judgment? What is the purpose of the judgment? Until when do you not judge and avenge? So the question is, what does Jesus begin doing? The signs announce that the judgment is about to begin. What happens in the judgment? The martyrs, as well as all the others, are what? vindicated in the judgment. So let's notice here. There is thus a close connection between the fifth and sixth seals. In the fifth seal, there are two groups of martyrs, one past and one future. The signs in the sixth seal are an announcement that the period of oppression of the first group of martyrs is about to end. On the other hand, the signs of Revelation 6:14 through 17 are an announcement that the oppression of the second group has come to an end, because God's people are going to be delivered by the voice of God, which causes the cosmic global earthquake and moves the sun, the moon, and the stars out of their places. Now I'm going to read this statement from Ellen White on these signs that took place in 1780, 1755, and 1833. Prophecy not only foretells the manner and object of Christ's coming, but presents tokens by which men are to know when it is near. Not imminent, near. Said Jesus, "There shall be signs in the sun and in the moon and in the stars. The sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars of heaven shall fall, and the powers that are in the heavens shall be shaken. And then they shall see the sign of the Son of Man in the clouds with great power and glory coming." The Revelator just thus describes the first of the signs to, what is the next word? To precede the second coming, second advent. There was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. So she separates the two again. Now, we don't have a lot of time left, but I want you to notice here the meaning of Luke 21, verses 25 and 26. And let's read these verses. "And there will be signs in the sun, in the moon, and in the stars. And on the earth distress of nations, with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear, and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of heaven will be shaken." Seventh-day Adventist evangelists frequently use these verses to describe the present turmoil in the world. However, a close look at the context indicates that these verses are describing what will occur at the very end of human history as an announcement of the second coming of Christ. We must be careful not to take these verses out of their legitimate context. They are not referring to the present distress among the nations. They are actually referring to the distress that comes when God's voice moves sun, moon, and stars out of their places. Because we find the same statement that we find in Matthew 24, where it says the powers of heaven will be what? Shaken. And what are the powers in heaven? The sun, the moon, and the stars. When God utters His voice in deliverance of His people, it shakes the heavens and the earth. The sea is lashed in its fury, and the whole earth heaves and swells like the waves of the sea, like it says in Luke 21. Mountain chains and islands disappear. Notice this statement from Ellen White. "The mountains shake like a reed in the wind, and ragged rocks are scattered on every side. There is a roar as of a coming tempest. The sea is lashed into fury." See, this is Luke chapter 21. The waves. "There is heard the shriek of a hurricane, like the voice of demons upon a mission of destruction. The whole earth heaves and swells like" what? This language is from Luke 21. "Like the waves of the sea. Its surface is breaking up. Its very foundations seem to be giving away." And now she's going to allude to Revelation 6:14 to 17. "Mountain chains are sinking. Inhabited islands disappear. The seaports that have become like Sodom for wickedness are swallowed up by the angry waters." So in context, where does Luke 21 fit? It fits with the second set of signs. Is there going to be distress among nations when people see the sign of the second coming of Christ and the earthquake and the sea? Yes, absolutely. Here, Ellen White is using the language of Luke 21, 25, and 26 to describe what will take place when God delivers His people at the second coming. The waves of the tsunami that hit Lisbon were like child's play compared with the waves of the sea that will engulf the world. final statement before we take a break. This is from Sons and Daughters of God, page 354. Once again, Ellen White is going to describe when the perplexities among nations, when the waves roar and everything. It's not in this present period, during probationary period, it's immediately before the second coming of Christ, or at the second coming of Christ. This is how it reads. There are troublous times before us. The judgments of God are coming upon our world. The nations of the earth, she doesn't say are trembling. She says what? Are to tremble. There will be trials and perplexities on every hand. Men's hearts will fail them for fear. And what shall we do in that day? Though the earth shall reel to and fro like a drunkard, and be removed like a cottage, if we have made God our trust, He will deliver us. So where does Luke chapter 21, 25, and 26 fit? It refers to the second set of signs in relationship to the second coming of Jesus Christ. So do we have clear in our mind that there's two stages to the sixth seal? One past and one future? And there are signs to announce both the past and the future? And how this fits with the fifth seal? Once again, in case I didn't make this clear, in the fifth seal, you have the judging and the avenging. The first signs announce that God is about to what? To judge. To set the record straight in the investigative judgment. The second set of signs is to announce that the King is coming, that Jesus is coming. So, and also that Jesus is going to what? He's going to now avenge God's people by raising those who died and by delivering from the death decree those who are alive when Jesus comes. The 144,000 sealed saints. So chapter 5 speaks about, the martyrs say, when are you going to judge and avenge? God says, don't worry. I'm going to give you signs to tell you that when I'm going to judge, and then you'll know when the judgment is starting, and then when I come, no sweat. I'll avenge you. So the fifth seal and the sixth seal need to be studied together. How many of you understood what we studied? Praise the Lord. That's good. Well, when we come back, we're going to study the sixth and seventh seals according to Ellen White. We're going to look at the seventh seal.